Welcome to Cross-Border Tax Talks, where we discuss the latest trends in international taxation, from U.S. tax reform to the world's most impactful geopolitical developments. I'm Doug McConey, PwC's U.S. International Tax Services leader. You can follow me on Twitter at XBorderTax. On this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks, we're recording in front of a live studio audience from Dana Point, California, at PwC's third annual International Tax Conference. And I'm really excited to be joined by Dr. Alexis Crow. Alexis holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and leads PwC's geopolitical investing practice, helping leading companies and asset managers with global investment decisions. Alexis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
Well, since the financial crisis almost 10 years ago, we've seen massive changes to the global tax landscape during the recovery, many of which we've discussed on the podcast. We've highlighted U.S. reform thus far at the International Tax Conference. We'll be getting to some of the global stuff tomorrow. But before we dive into some of the wonky tax stuff, can you provide us some context on the global economy, where we are today, where we're heading?
Sure, thanks so much. So I think if we consider the wider macro environment in which we're all making decisions, one thing to note is the extent to which we in advanced economies are grappling with, which is a dearth or paucity in demand. So Larry Summers beautifully put this as the secular stagnation argument, that in the shift from old economic, that is heavy industrial manufacturing, to new economic, that is light, tight electronic, healthcare services industry, we have not necessarily coped well in terms of wage growth. We haven't necessarily coped well in terms of productivity. And so there have been a number of different ways to deal with this. This is something that predated the financial crisis. And the aftermath of the crisis, we've dealt with it in the form of monetary policy. So we've had low to negative interest rates policy as a way of stimulating growth. That's had its own strong side effects, which we can come to. We've dealt with it in terms of tax policy, particularly in the United States, as a way of stimulating consumption and as a way of potentially catalyzing investment. And as we look around the world, I think today, we're grappling with the vulnerabilities that have been built into the system. So we may be talking about external shocks, such as trade, such as the possibility of a no-deal Brexit, such as Italy. But internally and domestically, we're still grappling with this flatlining productivity, the inability to invest in wages and skill in people, and that's having its own geopolitical repercussions.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing from a tax perspective is that tax law is trying to catch up with that as well. From a U.S. perspective, we have our new GILTI regime, which generally is a arguably minimum tax system, which we've discussed a little bit earlier today. And now we're seeing potentially other jurisdictions potentially trying to adapt to that. And really with the technology sector that could impact a number of other sectors, the tax law is trying to catch up to that.
Sure, and I think we've seen an element of, you highlighted as a sort of digital taxation, geopolitical tit for tat going on, where someone may hurt someone in trade, and then the rebuttal against this is a potential rise of taxation.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when it comes to Europe. But before we move to Europe, let's start with North America right here. In a prior podcast with Lisette Toutfest, who's here today, we discussed Mexico's new president and the largest free trade zone along the border. Can you talk about the latest developments on the trade relationships, not only with Mexico, but also Canada and the USMCA, and how that may impact our economics?
Sure. I think there's an expression in French which is plus ça change, which basically means what changes, and how much is actually changing. And I think with regard to Mexico, I think if you survey the Mexican politicians and decision makers as well as those in the United States, there's obviously asset prices have reflected this trading agreement. I would say, though, that I have graver cause for concern with the macro situation in Mexico, which may be improved slightly in terms of the outlook for capital flows to Mexico and the currency, but I have graver concerns there, which we can turn to in the Q&A. As regard to Canada, I think the uncertainty continuing still to weigh in Canada with regard to trade, full stop. We don't know exactly what the outcome will be. And I think the fact that America actually imports the highest amount of oil and gas from any country in the world comes from Canada. I think that we're seeing the impacts of the cost increases on things like paper towels because of the tariffs on pulp from Canada. So I think the Canadian-US relationship is by no means 100% improved in a way that actually Mexico has probably improved.
Yeah, I think what I'm seeing is a number of our clients are looking at potentially moving manufacturing locations, and we'll talk a little bit about China, looking for alternative manufacturing locations. Mexico obviously has been very popular for certain industries. As you're talking to CEOs and CFOs, what kind of recommendations and how do you answer the question of, should we continue to invest in Mexico? How stable of a regime and from a macroeconomic perspective?
It's a great question. I know that I'm sitting here in California, so I know we have some home territory, proximity, but I would say that from a macro standpoint, things are concerning in Mexico. You have a rapid expansion of the fiscal deficit, which unfortunately, despite having a lot of technocrats in government, has not really been meaningfully reduced over time. You have economic performance, which is implicitly tied to the performance of commodity prices, so it is not resilient to downturns in energy prices. On the geopolitical side of things, you have now a president who controls 100% of the state budgets. So really the checks and balances on power are not necessarily heartwarming. You have potential repeal of privatizations, looking at some of the Pemex concessions, whether or not that goes to constitutional reform. We've seen a lot of the cries of against the airport concession in this public vote that was taken. Most worrisome, he's starting to fire a lot of economists. And one knows you really shouldn't be firing economists. So it's also, what we're seeing is something we're actually seeing in India, which I know we'll come to, which is this suspicion of global economics and global movements in price, and then this reinstatement, a form of populism called economic nativism. And we're seeing that happen in Mexico. So I'm seeing more people. I think people were very gung-ho to begin with in terms of investing and corporate allocation. I think now they're taking a step back.
All right, so maybe we can head to Europe. Lots going on, particularly in the EU, but also throughout greater Europe. From a tax perspective, we have the Anti-Tax Avoidance Directive. You had mentioned the populism in Mexico. That is spreading throughout Europe as well. From a tax perspective, just a tremendous amount of changes. And I think one of the things that's really been surprising to me, Alexis, is that when I travel over to Europe, that corporate tax continues to be in the news regularly. It just does not seem to stick over here as much from a U.S. perspective, but that the public seems very interested in corporate tax policy. We've also seen the multilateral instrument, which is this new generation multi-jurisdictional treaty network that really is going to impact a lot of the people in this room. But maybe if we just talk from a macro perspective, what's going on in Europe? What do you see in your crystal ball?
Well, I would say that if we look at even Jerome Powell's comments this morning, he's calling out some vulnerabilities that attend uncertainty in the outlook, larger external shocks, shall we call them. So we mentioned the potential of a no-deal Brexit, Italy, Germany potentially entering recession this year, and all of these potentially connected to, amplified by uncertainty surrounding trade. That's masking a lot of the internal underlying vulnerabilities in the system, some of which we highlighted at the start of the discussion as a response to flagging demand and the inability to cope with a shift to services providing economies. In Europe, particularly the flatlining productivity is one. The second actually is a development of gross fixed capital formation and corporate investment actually picking up as a percentage of GDP, even outpacing the United States as a percentage of GDP, now being harmed by trade. Another one, of course, is the fragility of the European banking system. And this is one that is not necessarily called out all too often because there's so many vested interests at stake. If you're with European finance CEOs, they will throw the hot potato of financial risk across the United States and vice versa. But really what you're looking at is excess capacity, low return on equity, lack of profitability overall, and consolidation of banks. And I just don't see the kind of propensity for these banks to be purchased by a wealthy Middle Eastern royal family in a way that they were in the crisis.
You had mentioned an anecdote from the Spanish leader, the leader of Spain, that had mentioned a tax. Can you share that?
Oh, I think what we are referring to is actually Draghi, the ECB president, who has just actually recently spoken at Bologna. And I would actually urge all of you that deal with Europe to have a look at his speech on the ECB website, where he explicitly calls out state aid and says that any country that's making a favorable concession to a multinational could be considered to be illegal state aid and is therefore subject to investigation by the European Commission. What's fascinating is that Draghi situates this within a discussion about how European citizens can trust the institution of the EU. So it's all grounded in trust, as you're saying. It's like it's at the forefront of a lot of citizens and constituents' mindset, which again is not necessarily the case in the US, as you highlighted. So I would see, a growing, my longer term moral of the story for companies that have a global mindset is that's not necessarily a great environment. It may be where you made a lot of money in the past, but how's Asia looking today?
Right. Yeah, I think one of the things that we're particularly seeing in Europe is historically a lot of rulings have been given by certain jurisdictions, and given a lot of the reporting requirements and just frankly a change in the number of laws across Europe, that countries are moving away from those ruling type of processes and generally looking to lower their statutory rates. So as we look around Europe, there seems to be somewhat of a race to the bottom as far as low tax jurisdictions. So for example, we think of Ireland, which kind of set the bar initially at 12.5%. We've seen Hungary that lowered the bar at 9%. We haven't really seen anybody follow. Switzerland, obviously not part of the EU, is talking about their Swiss, I think it's 3, I'm not sure what 0.0 they're on. I think it's 3.0, where they may need to likely get a vote before they can change their corporate tax rate. But a lot of our companies, a lot of our clients are looking, when they are thinking about centralizing certain types of activities, whether it's financing activities, R&D, other type of regional leadership. Any reaction to those particular countries and, how companies might be able to determine what makes the most sense and where there might be geopolitical stability for them to be able to move such operations?
It's great that you highlight this because I think often some of these decisions can be siloed or considered in silo before they roll up. And I think it's very inadvisable to take a tax decision without the wider macro situation. So Ireland is a great example of that, where unfortunately, if you look at the future of Ireland in a no-deal Brexit situation, Ireland is behest and tied at the hip to the economic performance of the UK. So a lot of these countries that have made themselves out to be havens are still subject to the wider macro movements in the region, no matter how small they may be. I mean, a lot of wealth managers in Switzerland, for example, are looking to replicate their operations in the US and look to Hong Kong and look to Singapore because that's where the flows of capital and that's where the wealth is actually being created. So taking that decision in isolation, I think, is slightly grave. And I think all eyes are going to be on Ireland, actually, is what happens over the next few months with regard to Brexit.
Any reaction to Switzerland, right? Not part of the EU, has historically been able to remain pretty independent from an economic perspective. But, obviously a lot of global companies have centralized regional headquarters there. Any comments on Switzerland?
I mean, I think it's still seen to be favorable and holding steady. Longer term macro situation, you have a concern about immigration. How long is this going to keep up? It's a very, pardon my French, but it's a very old white story when you go to Zurich. And so the question is, about the future of dynamism, where is that going to come from? But as far as rules and regulations are concerned, I think it continues to be a favorable choice.
All right, well, let's turn to Asia now. So one of the things that I've grown up in the firm, Alexis, is working with a lot of retail and consumer product companies. And I can remember, 15 years ago where, a number of particular US multinationals were sourcing sometimes 95% of their product from China. Obviously, that economy has continued to expand, and we've seen companies look for cheaper costs of labor to be able to manufacture products, and that spread around throughout Asia. But before we go and talk about some of those other jurisdictions in Asia, where are we in China? Lots of discussions with a pending trade deal that we've heard about recently, but what are your views on China?
It's a great question. So we could spend all morning on China. I'm happy to speak to you all afterward to go deeper. But I think from the outset, the key word of what's happening with regard to trade in China is sentiment, and sentiment only. The fact that you slip from 6.7 to 6.6% of GDP growth is not colossal. It does not represent a giant slowdown. What it is representative of is this uncertainty has hit China in its jugular vein of economic growth, or the perception of its jugular vein of economic growth, because actually it's slowly replacing net exports of goods and services with consumption as a driver of growth. Now, on consumption, we've seen these keywords of consumption downgrade, so the Chinese consumer being a little more prudent than they have in the past. Rather than traveling to San Francisco for Lunar New Year, they're going to Sydney, they're going to Bangkok. Rather than getting the Bentley, they're going to get the Lexus. Rather than taking the taxi to work, they may take the subway in Shanghai, but that still represents dry powder. As far as the priorities of the government are concerned, I think it's very clear that Beijing is trying to replace quantity of economic growth with quality of economic growth. When I meet with the government, I think it's very clear that they are in good hands to shift from old to new economic growth. In that rebalancing, there will also be some things that make some foreign investors skittish, such as bankruptcies. Well, when bankruptcies happen amidst a massive deleveraging campaign, it's a great thing because things are being allowed to fail. So I think if you look at, another major cause for concern is just the leverage situation. You're actually seeing strong quantifiable impacts of deleveraging happen. You're seeing a cleanup of the wealth management products. So many of our financial services clients, many of our consumer clients are continuing to say, look, China long term, this is a market we cannot miss, and maybe we even have missed, and we're going to position ourselves to penetrate further.
And what about their views on protectionism and the ability, particularly for U.S. or non-China multinationals, to be able to succeed there in getting their product or services to Greater China?
So I think one thing is very clear. You're having some bad business practices be weeded out, such as forced technology transfer, IP rights, etc. These are things I would liken to the robber barons back in the 1930s. Like, there were bad policies, business policies in the United States that it also got weeded out over time. So I think you'll see things, adaptations start to happen. The government continues to profess a desire for greater financial opening, and I think you've seen that. Some German companies, every time I'm in Beijing, the other language that's there beyond Mandarin is German, and so many German companies are positioning themselves for that. Japanese companies, in a huge landmark shift, are also positioning themselves to be able to take advantage of this new opening. So it's happening. It may not be at the tempo that certain administrations or certain people would like, but it's happening.
So let's talk about the rest of Asia. Historically, Hong Kong, which I appreciate is part of China from a tax perspective, they do have different rules, however. But Hong Kong historically, as well as Singapore, have been very popular headquarter jurisdictions for both U.S. and foreign-based multinationals. As you mentioned, the rulings in Europe, Singapore and other jurisdictions there have also historically given rulings, and a lot of that process has changed as far as the type of rulings they'll give, what type of institutions that they will allow to have rulings, more looking at the tech, pharma sectors, for example. And so a number of our clients are looking, when they think about centralizing that regional headquarters, are now looking at other jurisdictions beyond Hong Kong, beyond Singapore, including Malaysia, Thailand, throughout. Can you talk a little bit about the region and what else you're seeing in some of these other jurisdictions?
Sure. I think it's helpful, actually, I can say this because it's publicly available, to think about the trail of a Nike shoe. And you can look at a Nike shoe, the production of a Nike shoe going from Japan to South Korea to China to Vietnam. And if you think about that as a multiplier of economic growth, both from the manufacturing footprint down to the consumption and services providing footprint. So here we would camp Hong Kong and Singapore into rich income Asia. As you say, these are well-saturated markets, very mature in terms of their tax offerings. Hong Kong aside is a kind of poster child for how to survive a trade war. If you look at a lot of what they've done to stimulate fintech and R&D, to make it more favorable for startups, it's fantastic. Singapore, unfortunately, I think at the moment may be subject to a poor macro story, just given recent announcements of a stimulus in terms of government spending in an election year. So that's one thing to think about in an election year. I would say that with the uncertainty surrounding China, what we are seeing a lot of global MNCs doing is not only moving their GVCs, their global value chains and their supply chains, and dispersing those to places like Vietnam, the Philippines, but also moving some operations as well, just because they can't deal with the uncertainty. So that's one of the key things that we're seeing is operations move in addition to footprints. And there I would say I like the macro story of Vietnam and the Philippines better than I do the macro story of Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia for different reasons. But I think you're starting to see a lot of MNCs and actually now global investors start to do a similar thing.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, they are continuing to review their tax laws and, again, looking for opportunities and incentives to try to bring in, you know, that investment. So let's shift now to South America. I know Brazil is something that you spent a lot of time thinking about, obviously a huge market for MNCs, but a tremendous amount of instability throughout South America. But maybe let's start with Brazil, and then we can tackle a couple of the other countries that have been in the news lately.
Sure. I mean, on the macro side of things in Brazil, I think in terms of capital flows, currencies, markets, investors from around the world have really put their money behind Bolsonaro. You've seen the Bovespa, the local stock index, hit historic highs since his inauguration this January. The Brazilian real being the best performing currency this year. And so I think many on the institutional side are ready and waiting for the wave of privatizations that will come about. As tax professionals, many are looking for the potential for tax reform to come about. Paulo Guedes, the new Minister of the Economy, has highlighted this, and that a way of paying for that tax reform would be from asset sales and privatizations. In my books, again, I think you can't divorce the tax decision-making and the potential for tax reform from the wider macro situation. And the key for Brazil now is to be able to continue to rein in government spending and to continue to be able to push through forms of pension reform. And so I think until that gets done, I would put tax reform further down the line. But what is being offered is potentially some kind of a simplification in a way analogous to what we saw, I think, in India with the imposition of GST and a greater simplification across provinces in the states and Brazil. So this would be hugely beneficial. In terms of sectors, I think consumer obviously continues to be the prize gauntlet here. Brazilians love to shop. They shopped all the way through the recession. And also I think the technology scene as well. We're seeing a lot of Silicon Valley companies, probably many sitting in this room, continue to be able to host their operations in Brazil and seeing some interesting kind of things at the municipal level, for example, in Sao Paulo, and creative things to be able to invite more business with a reduction of corporate tax.
Yeah, operating in Brazil from a tax perspective has always been one of the biggest challenges for people in this room. Just the many layers of local, regional, and national taxes just creates a lot of complexity. So we've heard some about the potential tax reform for some years, but I think that everybody, particularly the listeners on this podcast, would very much welcome simplification. There's obviously a lot of other uncertainty taking place throughout South America, particularly in Venezuela. How do you see what's taking place there impacting the rest of the region?
I think the biggest thing, I mean, something we haven't touched on today is just migrants and the politicization of migrants. And obviously you're seeing a refugee crisis happening with Venezuela to the extent that Colombia and Brazil will be able to work together to help migrants, I think is going to be a key issue going forward. Watch this space on Venezuela. As far as bright spots go, beyond Brazil, whether you're red or green on that or yellow, I think Peru and Colombia are also very exciting jurisdictions for us going forward. Particularly Colombia as it continues to stimulate its services providing economy. And with Duque there, I think many are considering this to be a pro-business environment. Another thing to touch on is the extent to which the Lava Jato investigation has really spilled over from Brazil across the continent. And one thing I think this does help us as global decision makers to do is to see the extent to which justice as an institution is very much fortified and vivified by this ongoing investigation. So even though it's seeped into and swept up to the presidency in Peru, I think many are actually happy that this is going on.
All right, well, last but certainly not least, want to maybe turn inward to the U.S. here. What are your views? We spent some time this morning talking about some of the various crystal ball gazing from a political perspective, where we had our inside tax policy and some of our top political gurus prognosticating about future elections and U.S. tax reform. What's your view on the U.S. economy and where we're heading? And for those in this room that run U.S. multinational organizations, any thoughts from a macroeconomic perspective?
Yeah, if we kind of come back full circle to where we started, which is that we have not been able to really cope with this dearth and demand. I think in the US, what we've seen is animal spirits unleashed with the promise of change, whether or not that's tax policy, whether or not that's deregulation, whether or not that's trade. And I think the way the markets have been behaving are one of animal spirits. We're now entering bear earnings territory. And I think for a number of different reasons, one of those being is a lot of companies have delayed the increase in cost inputs that have naturally actually occurred as a result of supply chain diversification. So we've not necessarily seen those be passed on to the consumer yet. And in which case, if 70% of US GDP growth comes from consumption, that's not a great situation. So we have that on the one side. You have on the other side the potential for some of this fiscal stimulus to unwind late 2019, early 2020. What happens when that happens? The other is leverage on balance sheets. One side effect of decade of low to negative interest rates is a pileup of cheap debt. And also a side effect of low to negative interest rates is passive investors wanting to get yield. And so a lot of that high yield debt has looked attractive for passive funds, particularly for European investors. And so unfortunately, that coupled with the deterioration of credit quality on balance sheets, particularly some of the small cap companies in the US, may indeed be a recipe for disaster. Now, Jerome Powell, of course, we've had this Fed pause where we're not necessarily seeing a rapid escalation of interest rate rises, so that takes a little bit of the heat off. But overall, I think you're looking at a very grave situation, particularly with the small caps.
Well, you provide an interesting landscape and view, I should say, of the global landscape. And I think one of the things that we have as challenges as tax professionals is that, as those within the business organization, CFOs are coming to us and they want to understand what the tax landscape is and what are the tax consequences of moving markets or of doing a deal. One of the challenges that we have as tax professionals is that the global landscape is so dynamic. I mean, even from a U.S. perspective, where we have U.S. reform, we still don't know exactly how those rules are going to apply until we get the actual regulations that will be retroactive, potentially back to when U.S. tax reform was enacted. The macroeconomic perspective is obviously something outside of my expertise, our expertise, but is something that really drives a lot of those decisions as well. And what I foresee, kind of looking at my crystal ball, is that there are probably some pent-up decisions that really, frankly, haven't been made because partly of the uncertainty from a geopolitical perspective, partly because of uncertainty from a tax perspective, because it's oftentimes difficult for us to know exactly, what the landscape is going to look like. And I certainly think that throughout the end of this calendar year that we're going to see more certainty. I think it's going to continue to be very dynamic, particularly from a digital perspective and what we're seeing with BEPS 2.0, and we'll get into some of that tomorrow. But a very challenging landscape for all of us, and I appreciate you bringing your geopolitical insight.
Yeah, I think just a moral of the story, I would say the quick summary would be find countries with a better macro situation, because that's where the real bandwidth for tax reform can actually happen in a sustainable way. The second would be focus on job creation. How is the job that you're creating in one jurisdiction actually generating economic growth back in America? And very few people are doing that. I'm not saying that as tax professionals, that's your domain, but it's something to be able to think about as you create jobs in other territories.
Well said. Well, thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks. Thank you, Dr. Alexis Crow, the leader of PwC's geopolitical investing practice. I'm Doug McConey, PwC's International Tax Services leader. Stay tuned in 2 weeks for another exciting edition of the Cross-Border Tax Talks.